Welcome back to another brief tutorial on Capture One. It's been a while since I've done my last Capture One tutorial, so I'm going to jump into my final video of the year, looking at 3 quick ways to improve your landscape editing of your images using Capture One Pro. There's a good chance that you've gone through several tutorials already looking at the various ways that you can edit a photograph. Now, the thing is that landscape photography editing doesn't actually have to be complicated or hard. You can actually speed it up with just these 3 tricks that I'm going to show you in this particular video. What's cool about these 3 tricks is that they don't necessarily apply uniquely to Capture One, and you can use these same concepts or these same editing tips with any kind of editing software that you use. I'm going to show you how you can use graduated filters, the radial filter, and targeted saturation to basically speed up and improve your landscape edits. Before I delve into this though, please remember to pop a like and a subscribe inside the various blocks around the screen. We're almost up at 5,000 subscribers. Your support goes a long way to enabling the continuation of this channel. So thanks very much. Remember to like, and here we go, back into 3 tips on how to improve your landscape editing. To start with, when we look at a landscape, the first thing that you're going to realize is that the sky is usually brighter than the foreground. So traditionally what we've used is graduated neutral density filters, which have a darker portion at the top of the glass and a clear portion at the bottom to allow you to balance the exposure in your photographs. Now, a lot of photographers these days think that that's no longer necessary because of the dynamic range of your sensors, and they're partially right. But the easiest way to get around this, if you have a decent exposure already, is to basically create a gradient in your exposure. So I'm going to start with this photograph taken in Setlabatebe in Lesotho during a workshop that I was running last year. You can see that the sky is fairly bright and my foreground not so bright. So what I'm going to do is simply, without doing anything else to the photograph, I'm going to grab a gradient filter, which in my case I have set to shortcut key G. You can take a look at this video that I've posted in the link in the top right-hand corner where I look through how to create your own shortcuts. I'm going to take my gradient filter and I'm going to pull it down so that I am going to basically affect the area above this central line. The important thing about gradient filters is that we don't necessarily take the gradient from the top and drag it down to the bottom. A lot of photographers think that's how you use a gradient filter. It's not. Gradient filters work such that the top of the line that you have drawn is where the full effect of your filtration is going to be, or the full effect of the change to the image. The bottom line is going to be where there is no change to your image, and the area in between is the gradient itself. I'm wanting to effectively darken my sky over here, so I'm then going to grab my exposure and I'm just going to darken it to further balance between the top and the bottom. And you can see that if I were to drag them together, my line is going to be very obvious. But if I were to pull them apart, the line becomes less obvious. So this is very important because we've now darkened the sky over here. But the problem with using a gradient filter in a conventional sense is that you're also going to end up with a darker portion to your the peaks that you're going to be using. That's actually relatively easy to correct though, because using the gradient filter means that we have access to all of the other controls inside our editing parameters. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up my shadows, and you can see that now my sky has been darkened nicely in the background, but my foreground, which has dark components reaching up into the sky, has been corrected by essentially brightening up my shadows in that particular section. So that's the first way that we're going to use our gradient filter to create balance in the sky. The foreground is also often a lot darker. So what we can do is create another mask over here, or we're going to create a new layer. So I'm going to say new layer, and I'm going to use another gradient tool, but this time I'm going to drag it from the bottom upwards, more or less an inversion of the previous one. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to very gently bring up our exposure. I'm going to add a bit more contrast there as well. And already you can see that I have changed my photograph quite dramatically simply by adding those gradient filters. So I'm just going to say show the before and after. There's before and after. literally just using the gradient filter for the sky and the foreground. And the thing is, you can do this for a vast number of your landscape photographs as well. So let's jump through to this photograph, which is actually a image stitch taken in Madagascar last year on a workshop that I was running there. And we're going to do the same things again. So I'm going to first crop the image just so that we have gotten rid of all of the bump around the edges. So I'm going to go unconstrained and I'm going to pull that into a composition that I am happy with. There we go. We're going to take our gradient filter and we're going to darken up our sky. So I'm using, in this instance, the center of my gradient is pretty much going to be my horizon line, but it doesn't have to be. You could also move it up and down or back and forth. So let's this time use the curve control, which I actually really enjoy using. And I'm going to darken my sky a little bit and add some more contrast to it. My sky has been darkened, and you can see if I just click before and after, I've just darkened up the sky a little bit. Then I'm going to create a new layer and we're going to do the opposite. And we are going to brighten up our foreground. There we go. Just need a bit more shadow there. And there. I actually want to go back and brighten up my sky a little bit more over here. There we go. And what I would also like to do is add some more color to that. So I'm going to jump through to my saturation slider and just pop some color into my sky over there. Okay, so that's the first basis that we can attack our landscape images with. But the second trick that I'm going to show you is that of a vignette. Now, ordinarily, if we want to add a vignette, all we would do is we go down to our vignetting control and you just drag in to the left or the right. Now, the problem is this is actually relatively imprecise. And yes, there are different ways that you can apply your vignette, but a far better way to apply the vignette would be to create your new layer. You're then going to use your radial filter. Now, the radial filter is up here on the top bar. I'm going to click on that. You can also use the shortcut key T, which I have in my setup. And essentially, wherever you draw your radial from is going to work in exactly the same way as a gradient filter works. So your inner ring is where there is going to be an effect. Your outer ring is where the effect ends, and the gradient is going to be in between them. However, I'm wanting to invert that because I'm going to turn my radial filter into a vignette control. To invert that mask, what you would do is you would go through to your adjustment layer and you would right click and say invert mask. Now if I look at where my mask is, and by holding down the M button, you can see that it's at the outside of the image that is going to be affected. If I were to bring that in, you can actually see how this is going to all be made a little bit softer, and we can continue to adjust it. What's important about this though is that I can actually adjust where I want my vignette to be. So for instance, I can have it centered around the pirogue that's sitting in the foreground, or I can have it centered as a traditional vignette. So I'm going to put it around the pirogue over here, and we're going to just darken our exposure using the curves control here, so that we have that. But importantly, I want to keep some of the brightness that's happening on the edges there. So I can tweak my exposure here in a way that I would never have been able to do using a conventional vignette. And in fact, if I want to perhaps throw a little less detail on the edges, I can use that same control and continue down to clarity and actually bring my clarity down, or pull it up if I want to actually get a little bit more crunchy detail just on the edges. So I'm just going to pull it down just a touch to give an effect almost of a slight focus change. There we go. So that's a nice way to create a vignette, but using a radial filter. And in fact, I can go ahead and rename these. So I'll right click there and I'll call that my vignette. And then the layer below, my foreground. And the top one, which was the linear gradient mask, we'll just call our sky. So those three controls already can vastly change your photograph. Here's my before and after. Remember, I didn't even start by editing the photograph initially, which is what I would usually do. And this brings me to the third trick of the video. Importantly, when we want to saturate the colors in our controls, we have a very good slider here, our saturation slider. If I go to the base image layer and I bring my saturation up, you will see that it saturates the colors quite nicely. Capture One, unlike Lightroom, the saturation slider is more like a vibrance slider. If you were using Lightroom, you would probably use your vibrance slider as opposed to your saturation slider. However, in both cases, it's basically a global control. It's affecting the entire image if I saturate to the right or if I pull to the left and I make it a desaturated image. Far better for landscape photography actually is to go down through to your color editor, and we're going to hit our basic over here. Now, with landscape photography, very often all we need to do is actually target a color and saturate that. And again, the saturation is actually more akin to a vibrant slider than a full saturation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target these colors here, the cyan and the blue. And by just increasing those saturation points, we're effectively adding saturation to our sky and making that pop. If I'd like to get a little bit more of the reds out as well, I can go into my reds and I can saturate those too. But unlike using the vibrance or saturation slider as a global control, we're only targeting certain colors and essentially making them pop. Now, one of the interesting things about landscapes is that the blues and the oranges, essentially complementary opposites of each other, if you push those colors, you're going to get pop in your landscapes. So that's your third trick, is rather use your targeted saturation of a particular color range to add a little bit more realistic saturation to your photograph, as opposed to doing a global saturation control. So those are your three tricks: gradient filter for the sky and the foreground, radial filter for your vignette, and targeted color adjustment. And I'm going to look at two other photographs to quickly demonstrate that. So let's go to this stationary fishing trawler in Walvis Bay, which basically remains stationary year round, and they clean off the guano and stuff like that from time to time. And we're going to use those same principles, although this time I'm actually going to start with how I would usually start a photograph, and that's to take my levels control and just bring that in a little bit. And now you can see that with the exposure corrected like this, the sky is too bright. So the next step, as I've suggested already, is to darken my sky. So I'll take my gradient filter and I'm going to pull that down. And we are going to darken that sky. I'm going to use my curves control. There, that's better. That's looking good. We're getting some nice detail there. And we can even add contrast into that because we're using the curves control. So there we go, there's my curve. My problem, as you have already noticed, no doubt, is that I'm also darkening the top of the boat. But that's fairly easy because all I need to do is go through to my shadow control and I'm going to pull that up. And we have now corrected that issue. So that was our sky. So we're going to call that sky quickly. Next control we're going to use is add another layer, and we're going to do the same thing with our gradient tool, and we're going to pull it up from the bottom over here, more or less in the same way that we were working earlier on. And we're now going to brighten that up. And again, I can add contrast inside there if I would like to. We do need a vignette over here to concentrate some of the attention inside the image itself. So before going into my vignette, I'm going to just rename my foreground layer. So I've renamed my foreground layer. We're then going to create a new layer over here, and I'm going to use my radial tool. So shortcut key T if you want to use that. And we're going to draw this around the tanker or trawler and just make it nice and soft. Have that all corrected there. Now I'm going to darken that ever so slightly. Oops. One problem over there, it's darkening my boat because of course I haven't inverted it. So I have to remember to go through to my adjustment layer, right click and say invert mask. And that's better. That's what we're wanting. And I can just shape this correctly as I'd like it. There we go. I'm going to open up some of my shadows a little bit because I don't want it to be too obvious on the foreground over there. There we go. Before moving on, I'm just quickly going to go down to my image layer and also say refine and click on remove dust, and voila, all my dust is going to disappear automatically. That's a pretty impressive thing, that. Anyway, going back to my adjust parameters, and we're going to call that layer my vignette layer. It's misspelt, but that doesn't matter. Then I still feel like this foreground does need to be slightly lighter. So what we're going to do is, like we've done with the vignette, I'm going to add another layer and we will call this ship. And I'm going to use still my radial filter, and I'm going to bring that out a little bit, make it relatively soft, and we're just going to lighten up our ship itself. Okay, and then as a last little trick, I'm going to go down to my image layer and we're going to punch out our blues for saturation. And I definitely think my targeted oranges over there, I want to brighten up. And there you go. So very simply, using targeted color adjustment, the radial filter and the gradient filters, we have edited our photograph from this to this. As a final image, I'm going to take a look at this photograph that I recently shot at the Malarife Lighthouse in Iceland, and I am going to do the same approach as the previous photographs. So we are going to quickly make sure that we have the correct exposure, and as you can see in my histogram, it's all pretty much the same already. So I do think I'm just going to lift my shadows just a touch in the foreground. The next step is to darken my sky, so I'm going to into my gradient filter, pull that down so that it's more or less along the horizon with a little bit of a softened edge over there. There we go. And you can actually see what it's going to be doing in this case. I might lift it just slightly above the clouds, in fact. Right, now we're going to darken that, and you can use either your curve control or exposure. I'll try exposure in this instance. And remember, importantly, I want to lift my shadows. And what that's done is it's made sure that my lighthouse and the foreground cliffs, they haven't gotten too dark with my filter that is affecting my sky over there. Okay. The next step we want to do is to lighten up our foreground. So I'm going to rename this as sky, and then we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this one foreground. And using our gradient tool once more, we're going to lift this up. With that in place, I'm then going to take my exposure and I'm going to brighten that up in the foreground, as well as open up my shadows, because we wanted to open up this area here. Yes, much better. I prefer that. And I also feel like it needs a little bit more warmth. So what I will do is I will add some warmth just to my foreground. That looks somewhat better over there. So you can see by using the masking effects, you are effectively able to use more than one control on that area. It's not just exposure. It can be anything to do with any of the sliders that you have availability to. Now, one of the things that I noticed with this particular image is, again, that a small vignette is going to work, but importantly, I also want to lighten up this side of the image. Create a new layer using quite a large radial filter. I am going to shape that out so that it feels like it fits the shadowy portion of the image on this section. And we're going to open up the shadows again on that little area, and a little bit more exposure and contrast. So just keep that sort of grittiness to it. There we go. So that's also opened up the image quite nicely. There, that's better. Right, let's just call this our foreground rocks. And importantly, it is affecting our sky over here. So what I'm now going to do is adjust this by going into my luma range. Now the luma range, you can see where my mask is over here, and I want to affect all of my shadows. So I'm going to pull this to the left in that case, and I'm going to pull out my radius far to the right. It works like feathering the micro contrast of the detail itself. So the further to the right, the broader the area around the pixels it's going to affect. The further to the left, the more it's going to end up looking like an HDR image. So now what we're going to do is we are going to pull back on our brightness here, and effectively we are going to be removing the areas apart from the rocks themselves. There you go. You can see my water disappear as I do that, and you can soften that out with essentially a feathering of that mask. But notice it no longer affects my sky over there. And there we go. There's my foreground rocks, nicely lightened up. We can do the same thing again to the actual lighthouse itself, although this is one instance where I believe that it is probably easier just to use our AI brush. So I'll say adjustment layer, lighthouse, and I am going to just let my automatic tool select it. There we go. Perfect. And what we'll now do is just brighten that up a touch. Keep the contrast and just open up the shadow a little bit. I find it's too strong at the bottom, so I'm going to go into a conventional eraser tool. I don't want to apply too much, so I'm going to bring my opacity and flow down, and I'm just going to balance out the base of that. And there we go. Right, last little trick, let's just add our vignette. So new adjustment layer, use our radial filter, bring that one out quite far. We want to have it relatively soft. There we go. That's it. And I'm just going to pull this out so that we can make it nice and big. There. And let's just darken our edges by remembering to actually say invert mask. There we go. And last but not least, go down to our image layer, into our colors, saturate our blues a little bit, and we definitely want to saturate our oranges. Right, and here is our before and after using those 3 tricks. So that's it. Remember that your landscapes tend to be bright in the sky, dark in the foreground. So what we're doing is using our gradient filters to adjust that. You're then using a radial filter to be able to create a targeted vignette, which is pretty cool because it's not just darkening the edges. You can change the contrast, you can change your clarity, you can even use dehaze as part of your vignette control. And then lastly, when you are trying to add your color, you don't necessarily need to do a full vibrance slider. You can target your colors, particularly blue and orange, to be able to increase that sense of color and crispness to your landscape photographs. Right, so those are your 3 very quick tricks to Capture One. I trust you have a fantastic holiday season ahead of you, whatever you happen to be celebrating, and I will catch you on the new year in 2025. Thanks again to everybody who has supported the channel through the course of the year. The channel has grown pretty much exponentially since from where it was this time 2023, and thank you. I really appreciate all the support that you've given in being able to do that. Right, see you on the other side of 2024. Cheers.